Hi, my name is Marco Pupecki, and I'm a graduate assistant working with biological sciences this year to support writing in the research courses. I studied the evolution of light color in firefly signaling. As you all know, there is a required research paper due at the end of the semester. Writing is a fundamental component of the scientific process, so we've established this workshop series to provide guidance and equip you with the skills necessary to become confident science writers. Today, we're going to focus on the elements of the scientific writing style, searching for references, and the introduction section of a research article. We are here to help you with your writing, so please let me or Dr. Chris Miller know if you have any questions. I'm also happy to schedule a writing conference with you anytime before December 1st. Another thing I'll add is that normally this workshop is given live, so we would work through activities together. But since I'm not able to do that, I'll just explain them here. So for this first one, you are all scientists, you're all doing research. So let's talk about the scientific process. What is the first step? So they're all scrambled up right here. What comes first? Well, first you're going to want to research your topic and get a deep understanding of what you're about to do. This will then lead into thinking of an idea. It'll be a lot easier to come up with an idea, a research question, and identify a hypothesis if you know where the holes already are. Then you're going to plan your experiment. How can you best test that hypothesis? This will then lead into experimental design and actually carrying out those experiments. You'll do this concurrently with collecting and recording data, which ensures the rigor and reproducibility of your study. Lastly, you're going to come to a conclusion by analyzing your data for significant trends or patterns. This is your interpretation. So this is the scientific process, but what's wrong with this? What is it missing? Well, scientists need to communicate their findings. So if a scientist comes to this really important conclusion, but nobody knows about it because they didn't communicate it, that's a problem. So it's incredibly important for scientists to know how to communicate their research. Another thing I'd like to emphasize is that although the scientific process is often depicted as a linear sequence of steps, you will often visit each of these steps multiple times. It's an iterative process. So what that may look like is, say you've planned your experiment and you start with your experiments. Maybe they're not working. You're going to have to go back to the planning stage and redesign a new experiment. Maybe you're collecting data and you're realizing that it seems a bit inconclusive. This may mean you'll have to go back to the planning stage as well, design new experiments to collect additional data to interpret. You may even have to think of a new hypothesis. So again, you will visit each of these steps multiple times. You'll do a lot of backtracking and circling, and that's okay. That's just science. So there are many ways to communicate scientific research. The most important thing is to know your audience. If you're communicating science to a broad audience, which means the general public, that may look like a scientific magazine article, a TED Talk, or an outreach activity. If you communicate science to a professional audience, which means other scientists in the field, that may look like a peer-reviewed journal article, a talk at a conference, or a poster presentation at a conference. Today, we're going to focus on the written component of professional communication, the research article. So just to reiterate, the purpose of writing a research article is to communicate scientific knowledge through writing. And specifically, your objective is to communicate your research in a paper. So take a moment to consider this quote. We talked about the importance of recognizing your audience and coming up with this message to communicate the story of your research. So in order to do that, you need to be very familiar with your topic so you can explain why your work is important and relevant. The introduction is really where you begin to do this. So like the scientific process, writing is a process. It begins by familiarizing yourself with the literature surrounding your research question. Then, I would suggest before you even get started with writing to make an outline. This will help you organize your points into a logical flow. It will also make the rough draft much easier because you've already laid out the structure of your paper. You already know what you want to say and what references you want to include, which is often the most difficult part of writing. Once you've created your outline, you can begin writing, and I would suggest to focus on writing content first. Just put information onto the page. It doesn't have to make sense yet. I know for myself, I often want each sentence to be perfect when I write, but I would focus more on just getting those thoughts across. Then you can edit for clarity and flow. Ask yourself, how could you clarify those points? Is there a logical flow of idea? Can I use more specific words? What can I improve about that? How can I make those ideas fit together? So after you've read it through, you've edited, you're gonna do it all over again. So read it to yourself, use the revision guide that I will post to reflect on your writing and seek to improve it. You can also schedule a writing conference with me. But it's also important to ask people who are also involved in your research discipline for help. This is because when you are writing and something may seem very clear to you, it may not be to someone else. So someone with a bigger picture of your research topic may be able to help with this. So I would say you could ask your advisor or lab mates for suggestions, and you could also do a peer review with other undergraduate researchers in your lab. This will give you really important feedback on what you're doing well and what you could seek to work on. So scientific research articles, again, are intended to communicate scientific knowledge with a professional audience. So their goal specifically is to do that efficiently. So to address that, scientific articles are structured into specific sections, which are the abstract, the introduction, methods, results, and discussion. This sort of organization helps scientists, again, extract that information they need. Another way that scientists communicate their work effectively and efficiently is a very specific writing style, and that's scientific writing. And so we're going to talk about a few examples from the book, The Elements of Style by Strunk and White. So you may have heard of the active voice before. So the active voice is when the subject comes first in a sentence and the subject performs the action. When you use the active voice, you often reduce the amount of words in the sentence, which makes it much more clear, direct, and have much more impact. So in this example, I will always remember my first trip to Boston. I am coming first. I'm remembering my trip, the action. And it's very clear. It's a very easy sentence to interpret. But if you look at the passive example, my trip to Boston will always be remembered by me. I'm coming at the end of the sentence now. It's much more wordy and complex. And it's you kind of like you have to extract meaning from it. So I would say to avoid the passive voice with the exception of the methods section and focus on using the active voice. So for statements in positive form, what I mean by that is to use words that actually describe the subject or action rather than explaining what it is not. So here, in the positive form, he usually came late, short and succinct. The evasive form, as in this extra word, not, and it's essentially explaining what is not happening. He was not often on time. And again, this makes that sentence wordy, long. You really have to think about what it means. That's not communicating information effectively. So additionally, scientists will often write in a way where they use specific concrete language and omit needless words. You've already heard me say specific frequently, and I will continue to say it a lot because it's really important. So for example, in this sentence, concrete, it rained every day for a week. It's saying exactly what's happening. It rained every day for 1 week. But in the wordy version, a period of unfavorable weather set in. Well, there's a lot of uncertainty here. What does a period mean? Could that be a week, a month, a year? What does unfavorable mean? Could it be rain, sleet, snow? Like, what does this mean? So don't let your readers guess. Make it very clear for them. Make it obvious. Say what you mean. Lastly, scientists will use a formal register. This means that, for example, in my research, I wouldn't say the word bug in a scientific paper. I would instead say insect, beetle, or firefly. So now let's talk about the guidelines. So you all have noticed that there's a paper rubric And I would definitely suggest to refer to this throughout the writing process to make sure that you're on track. So one of the things that we expect from the introduction is that it's written in present tense. Other sections of the paper may not need to be written in present tense. We also expect you to define key terms. So in the beginning of the introduction, when you provide background on your topic, you will need to include terms that are specific to your field. This is called jargon because they're not general knowledge. So if you use one of these words, which is unavoidable, just make sure you define it. Also, if you need to use acronyms, just be sure to state the full term once and then the acronym in parentheses. So for example, instead of writing out high performance liquid chromatography every time, which is quite a mouthful, you can just abbreviate to HPLC, and after you say it once, just refer to this technique as HPLC in the future. You'll also want to use explicit language. So what this means, again, is using specific words. State exactly what you mean. This makes it, again, very clear for the reader to understand what you're doing. So describe those subjects and actions as they are. Also, one writing technique is to use clear statements, and this helps you emphasize key points. So what that may look like is just outright saying, we hypothesize this. Our aim is that. Z is unclear. And again, this calls the reader's attention to important aspects of your paper. So we also expect your introduction to be about 2 to 5 paragraphs long. So it can be hard to tell sometimes if your introduction is long enough, but to address that, I would say to look through your introduction after you finished writing it and ask yourself if you have answered all of the different components of the introduction that we'll talk about. And if you have sufficiently, then your introduction is long enough. But if there's any missing information or unclarity, then revisit your introduction, add more references, rework it to make sure that it makes sense. So before you get started with your outline or your writing, I would suggest to visit these 2 research paper examples that are posted on the Biosciences website. These are examples of strong research papers, so you can refer to them to model your own work. Pay attention to, again, what terms they use and how they define them, the organization of the paper, how they make their figures and tables and label those things, and also just in general, the stylistic elements of their writing. This could really help you in your own work. All right, so let's get started with another activity. So this is the introduction, an excerpt from the introduction of a scientific paper, Landris et al. So read this to yourself and see if you can identify the aspects of the sentence structure, syntax and punctuation, and word choice that we talked about. So you can pause now and then we can come back and talk about it. All right, so I will just talk about things that I noticed. So first of all, this starts out with a very clear and direct sentence describing what pigment patterns are. I also noticed that there are a mix of short and long sentences. This helps the reader to follow the flow of the writing. So for example, this first sentence is fairly short, but the one that follows is a bit longer. So again, that variation helps the reader to pay attention and improves the flow. I also like how these authors provided definitions. So if you look down here when they say cryptic coloration, they then go on to explain in that same sentence what cryptic coloration is. It allows some animals to escape predators by matching their background. And then they cite that source. Where did they get that information? You can see that again down here where they discuss conspicuous coloration through aposematism. That's not a common word, so they're describing it here. It's evolved to act as a warning signal and advertise defenses to predators. Again, citing where that information came from. Also, you'll notice here where they say fixed color pattern. They could have just said color pattern, but that would be a little vague. So instead of, again, leaving that interpretation up to the reader, they inserted this extra word, fixed, which specifies what type of color patterns they're talking about. And this will be important for the reader later on. So the introduction gives readers background into your topic so they can understand why you asked this question in particular and why you are doing this research. If your purpose is not clear after the introduction, then the rest of your paper will not make sense. So let's expand on this. The introduction is often described as an inverted pyramid because it starts out broad. What is that broad research question or wider application that drives this research? This is the contextualizing stage because it puts your research into context. So by doing that, by putting your research into context, the authors will provide information on what studies have been done previously. What do we know about this broad research question so far? From that, the gaps will start to emerge. What don't we know? And that will bring us to the conceptualizing stage, where we point out the gap in knowledge and specifically state what we do not know. This will then lead into our study. So we will state our objective. What do we want to do to fill those gaps that we've identified? You will state your hypothesis and any predictions right at the tip of this pyramid. So again, this tip of the pyramid is where you will be addressing how you will resolve this gap in knowledge, and again, how that fits in with the broader application of this field or broader questions in this field. So as my advisor says, your hypothesis should feel inevitable by the end of your introduction. Readers should know exactly how you came to this conclusion as to how you want to approach this problem. So throughout the introduction, you're using references to place your research into the scientific literature. So framing is not manipulation, but it's making your purpose clear and justifying your reasoning. So framing involves providing relevant background information, which means it must have a direct connection to your research question. So for example, if you're studying why fireflies flash in synchrony, provide background information on their mating behavior and flash biology, as opposed to general information about their diet. Well, that's really interesting. It doesn't necessarily fit into your purpose of crafting your message and making your research objective clear. So we'll do another activity. This is the same excerpt you read earlier, the introduction section, or part of the introduction section from Landris et al., 2013. So again, I'll give you a few minutes to skim it. So I want you to consider, based on this information that's presented in this excerpt, where it may fit into the pyramid here. I also want you to, as you read, consider, what is the application of this research to the broader question? Can you find that? And also, what is already known? And also, how are citations used? All right, so you can pause. So now we're back. So let's think about that. And this excerpt would likely occur in the contextualizing stage of the inverted pyramid. And we know that because they're stating the application of broad research of the question right at the beginning. They're also describing how the function of color patterns in a wide range of animals could drive this work. So again, I would say that the application of this research is to understand more about adaptation and how phenotypic diversity is generated, and also to understand the function of color patterns across a wide variety of animals. We also are given information about what is already known. As you can see here, there's a lot of information about other studies and what they've found. So that's how those citations are used. They're used to, again, support these points, these additional studies that have paved the way for our study. You'll notice that these citations are shortened. So usually at the end of a paper, there'll be a reference list. These are in-text citations. So just a quick note on in-text citations. There's a very specific format that's required. So usually that will be, if there's one author, then you'll just write that author's last name and the year published. If there are more than two authors on the paper, then you will use the author's last name that comes first in the order and then the authors who come second, and then the year published. If there are 3 or more authors, you will just say the first author's last name, and then et al., with this period and a comma, and then the year published. Et al. Is Latin for and others. So for example, for this paper that we're studying, Landres is the first author's last name. You can see that this study was published in 2013. So this citation would look like Landres et al. 2013. And you can see in our previous example, here, there's one author, Endler. And so you just see his last name with the year 2006. In this example, there are 2 authors, Stevens and Marileta, 2009. All right. So again, skim this excerpt and see if you can place it on this inverted pyramid. So it would be in the conceptualizing stage. So specifically, how do we know that? How do we know that it's in this phase? Well, can we identify the gap in knowledge? Look at this excerpt and see if you can identify where that gap in knowledge occurs. Well, I would say that the gap of knowledge is stated right here. Well, as some of the metabolites involved in MVT color production have been identified, nothing is known about the internal hormonal mechanisms controlling color production. So right there, they say nothing is known. That's a clear indicator that they are about to announce the gap in knowledge. So you can use these writing structures as well. Those are those clear writing structures we talked about to, again, draw the reader's attention to key points of your writing. Another thing that researchers should consider doing in their introduction is describing their study species and emphasizing why it's important and or ideal to study to pursue this question. So here, they're describing how crab spiders can change color over several days to match the color of the flower on which they sit. So they provide a good system in which to study the mechanisms underlying reversible color plasticity. So again, they're highlighting why they've chosen crab spiders to study reversible color changes. And that's because these spiders actually do undergo those color changes. You wouldn't want to study that phenomena in a species where they have a fixed color pattern. So again, making that very clear for your reader, kind of honing your message, is very important. So lastly, where in the inverted pyramid should this paragraph go, if you were to guess? And how do you know? Well, I would say that this excerpt would go in the resolving stage. And we know that because they come out right here with their aim. This study aims to determine the environmental and hormonal factors underlying morphological color changes and the biochemical metabolites produced during these changes. So again, that's where they're getting into the specifics here, where they're describing their objective for how they're going to address this gap in knowledge. So in your paper, we also suggest for you to include your hypothesis. So again, refer to the guidelines here and include your hypothesis at the very end of your introduction to make your aim clear. So when you're finished writing the rough draft of your introduction, you can begin the revising stage. So this is an example of how you can do that. So again, reread your introduction and ask yourself if you could answer or find the answer to each of these questions in the introduction. If the answer is yes, then you can ask others for feedback. But if the answer is no, I would say to go back and address those questions. So again, before you get started with your writing, take time to familiarize yourself with your topic. This requires you to immerse yourself in the scientific literature surrounding your research question. One way to get started in doing this is to ask your advisor or lab mates for suggestions. You could read the work that your lab has published. Additionally, you could do your own search using Google Scholar, the UGA Library Multi-Search Tool, PubMed, or the Web of Science. And you could specifically look for articles that have similar methods, research questions, or a study system. You can also look up references from your current article. So in the example we looked at, they had all those citations in the introduction. You could then look up that reference list at the end and then also read that paper because it could be relevant to your research topic as well. So here are some links to some common search databases. So here's an example of how to generate APA citations. So just to be clear, we do not require a specific citation format. Just use whatever convention is required by your discipline. But citations can be very confusing, so I wanted to walk you through this example. So one way that I generate my citations is by navigating to Google Scholar and then searching for the title of the paper that I'm interested in. So here it is, that's what the result will look like, but that's not the citation. So to get the citation, I will click these quotation marks. This will bring up this window, and I will copy and paste the APA format. So just make sure when you're generating your reference list that all your references are using the same format. I also recommend immediately generating a citation for each paper that you read, so you can keep track of your reading and cite all your sources. Keep them organized in alphabetical order for ease. So again, you can use Google Scholar to do this. I also find it helpful to use a program that allows you to store references of different papers and also take notes on them. This is very helpful. So I use Mendeley, OneNote, or EndNote to do this. Also, while you should be aware of pivotal papers in your field, most of your references should be more recent, within the last 10 years. As research and technology rapidly advance, this will keep you current. Additionally, one thing that may help you is making an annotated bibliography. So what this will look like is if you have that reference list going from all your Google Scholar citations, you could just include a brief summary of the research article, describe key points, methods, or findings, and specifically how this reference could relate to your work. How could you incorporate this into your own paper? You want to, again, include that citation, and this will help you a lot when you begin writing because you'll have that reminder of what you learned from that study. If you need help searching the literature or with your writing, please reach out to us. You could also set up a virtual consultation with librarians at the Science Writing Center. So all you have to do is go to this website link and set up a time. You can also get help on your writing itself. Another opportunity to do that is a writing center in Park Hall. You can, again, make an appointment online, and all appointments are remote, so by phone or Zoom. So again, the Science Library can help you identify sources and also with your writing. So lastly, I just wanted to remind you all that this is a very unusual semester, and don't worry if you feel like your research isn't going as it should, because research is not conducted as usual. So if most of your research is still in the planning stage or you're waiting for results, it's fine. Just work with whatever you have. And another thing I wanted to note is if you're in undergraduate research and your research is part of a larger project in your lab, you could focus on how your study will support those bigger aims. And if you have any questions about your project, it's important to reach out to your advisor and lab mates to clarify that. It will really help you with your writing and your understanding of what you're doing. And lastly, we are happy to help you with questions related to your writing. So thank you very much for your time. Our next workshop will be focused on writing the methods and results section of a scientific paper. And again, please let me know if you have any questions or would like to schedule a writing conference. Thank you and see you next time.